enterprise. And therefore, for his own name's sake, he's going to see to it that this people, in the way of obedience, as long as they are obedient, are going to prosper and so on. And so within a theocracy, you get guarantees like bring your tithe into the storehouse and you'll see what a blessing I will pour out from heaven. You won't be able to contain it. That's a theocratic guarantee. Because a theocracy is a prototype of heaven. This is what heaven will be like. And in heaven, you have all of the saints perfected, glorified, the full image of God, and they're guaranteed prosperity, the prosperity of Sabbath glory forever and ever. Those things go together in a theocracy, piety and prosperity, not in the realm of common grace. In the realm of common grace, piety doesn't necessarily go together with prosperity. Job found that out. The whole teaching of the book of Job is that the friends are wrong. Job's three friends are wrong when they say that the reason for Job's suffering is that he must have been unfaithful in some way or other. That's simply true. It doesn't fit the facts. It isn't true to the common grace reality of things, and it isn't true to the whole mystery of identifying with Christ and his sufferings, where in this world of common grace, you can, if you're as a believer and it's righteous and it's pious, you can perhaps more count on it than you're going to suffer than that you're going to be prosperous. So these guarantees then that God gives to the theocracy, you don't want to, as a preacher in the name of God, be giving to New Testament congregations, telling them that if they support the Lord's work faithfully and so on, and witness faithfully to Christ, that they can, the health and wealth gospel, in effect, with various variations of it that even some of our people are guilty of. And how many sermons have you heard on tithing that included that guarantee to the people as an encouragement to tithing, that they can anticipate that the Lord will prosper? He might not. But the point is, there's no guarantee of it. That's a theocratic guarantee, and you don't get that kind of guarantees elsewhere. In a theocracy, however, you do get that kind of guarantee. Now, this is a primary fundamental lesson in hermeneutics. How do you use your Old Testament? What can you lift out? Here you are, preachers and teachers of the New Covenant. What can you lift out of the Old Covenant and apply to your people? You better understand the structure of biblical theology and the covenants and what a theocracy is, so that you don't go breaking people's hearts, making them think that they're total failures if somehow they aren't rich and prosperous. It may be the best evidence that they are good Christians, that they are suffering, and so it's a serious business if you're the one who are the counselors and encouragers of the saints, and not to be deceiving them in the name of God in that way. Yes.
I'm thinking, what do you think of Paul's statement that godliness has prosperity for this world and the next?
That's it. Yeah, it does. Godliness provides us. He doesn't say prosperity, does he?
Profit.
Yeah, it's a profit. So it certainly does. And to be the people of God, how miserable would we be going through this world? You see, this present world, if we weren't believers and we didn't have the Lord and the comfort of His Spirit and so on. So it's not just in eternity that there's going to be benefits. There's godliness. We needn't be told all the benefits of our life in this world, knowing God as our Lord. Sure. But clearly, you see, the Paul teaches then that you can expect it to be suffering. You can be sharing in the sufferings of Christ, or whatever is necessary. And he himself certainly exemplifies the thing. If by any means he may at last then attain unto the prosperity of the resurrection. But meanwhile, all of this. So God's name was born by the kingdom people in Eden. To be created in God's image was to be God's children. To have God as Father, Lord, was to bear His name as surname. By the bestowal of God's name, they were acknowledged as belonging to Him, set aside as His theocratic family. As seen in the original form of the kingdom of God in Eden, a theocracy is a cultic kingdom through and through. That's cultic focus of the thing. You can't get away from that no matter where you go. The principle of holiness keeps with you. Everything is oriented to Jerusalem, as it were, as in Solomon's prayer. The people of God may be dispersed, but wherever they are, when they turn toward Jerusalem and direct their prayers to Zion, O Lord, hear them. That's the idea. You never get away from that orientation to the cultic center. The whole external realm is holy. Membership in the kingdom involves participation in the sanctuary of God, for the kingdom is God's sanctuary. To break covenant by unfaithfulness to the God of the sanctuary is to be cut off from the kingdom, for God is the king of the kingdom. It is this sanctuary identity of the theocratic kingdom that sets it apart in holy uniqueness from all other kingdoms found in the post-lapsarian world. No earthly state is a holy theocratic kingdom, and we shouldn't be trying to turn it into something. To do so is to defy God's common grace arrangements. It's to try to make God to be unfaithful to the unbelieving world, to whom he has committed himself, that they have equal rights in this whole common grace enterprise, that they have equal rights within any state that this is set up within it, and to try to turn such an arrangement then into a theocracy that enforces the religion of the true God is to make God, as it were, break his promise to the unbelieving world that they have equal rights there. All right, so I guess I can let you then, for the rest, read that next page or so. And I close on the top of page 34, but just by making the point then that you shouldn't think of a theocracy as a combination of a church and a state. So here's the church. Here on the common grace is the state. And it isn't that a theocracy is a church state or a state church. You can't just hyphenate those two things and come up with a theocracy. The present form of the church's existence, it exists within the common grace realm, and the state exists within the common grace realm. And out of common grace blocks, you can't build a theocratic holy house. And so theocracy is sui generis. It is a unique institution. It is a third simple thing by itself. Church is one thing, state is another, and there's theocracy, which is not a combination of the other two, because the other two are characterized by the common grace context in which they are found, whereas theocracy is the abrogation of common grace. It's the contradiction of common grace. All right, moving on here, page 34, the kingdom as a divine protectorate. So this place was a sanctuary theocracy. Point one. What a blessing then, that man is given a place within a realm over, and that of course implies that God is the ultimate king, man is a king under God, but it also involves that this is a divine protectorate. That glory of God is a focus for worship, but that glory of God, like the glory of God over Israel, was a canopy. It was a protection. The Lord hovering over his people. That's the picture that you get from the beginning. The King of Heaven, protectively there, is our shield above us in this original theocratic order. What a wonderful world that was then, that Adam and Eve were in. Well might God point to that to call them to faithfulness to him, the Lord of the covenant. He was a protecting God. The whole arrangement was a protectorate. And all right, now that brings us then to the thought of how consistent the idyllic ideal was this whole world of nature in that situation under the divine protectorate. And here then there's a couple points that I tried to make. Well, what was nature like in the world at the beginning? And on the one hand, I think that traditionally we over-idealize what the world of nature was like. And on the other hand, we underestimate the supernatural element that was there. I don't think I don't normally at least hear this kind of an idea of the mountain of God with the glory of God, that supernatural presence of God being part of the original situation in Adam and Eve in the garden. So that element, I think, is unfortunately neglected. But on the other hand, I think that there, how to put it, but the ideal character of nature is overplayed, and that's the kind of question that we address here on these next few pages. Under the first, the heading of consecration, sacrifice, and death. In other words, what we're going to be talking about is what was that world like before the fall? What kind of changes did the fall introduce into the realm of nature and in the order of the cosmos? Were there no thorns and thistles in the world before the fall? Is that what the curse involved? Were there no features in the world that would constitute a danger? Were there no bodies of water there that someone could fall into and get drowned? Were there no stones that someone could stub their toe against and break their toe? Or were there no cliffs that they might fall? Were there no dangerous elements around? Was the world one great big soft marshmallow where nothing even, what was the world like before the fall? Well, what I'm suggesting is that there's a tendency to over-idealize it into that big marshmallow where there was nothing that could ever constitute it, and that's simply wrong-headed, and it's missing. It's missing the reality that God and His presence and His care is the secret of your security and of your protection. And no matter what the dangers, it doesn't matter how many dangers are around. If God is your Lord and He is giving to His angels charge over you so you don't dash your foot against a stone, there can be the stones there, and there can be everything else there, but God is going to take care of you. That's what makes it an ideal paradise, a consistently prosperous place, and therefore there is no need to over-idealize the realm of nature, including up to the point of there being death in the realm of nature. Not human death, obviously. Now, let's all understand right from the outset that we are not heretics here and saying that there could have been human death apart from the fall and sin. Clearly, the Bible teaches sin is death is the wages of sin. That we all agree on. We're not talking about human death, but there are other levels of death. And what we are saying is that within the realm of nature, death certainly was present in the world before the fall, and that unfortunately is something that many Christians seem unable to assimilate and would identify with heterodoxy of some kind, even to suggest it. So that's the problem we're addressing, and the way we try to get at it then is to analyze what was from the biblical evidence, what was the nature of that world, and so that our heading, consecration, sacrifice, death in paradise. Here again with we saw then that the principle of consecration was there. We talked about that when we talked about God's Sabbath, and showed how the Sabbath brings to expression the idea of consecration, which has come to expression at these lower levels, all the subordinate things being consecrated to the interest of higher beings until everything at last is consecrated to God. So right in the structure of the creation as it came from the good hand of the Lord, you have the principle of consecration. Voss speaks about the principle of consecration as the very essence of true religion. In a simpler definition, all we mean by consecration here is the subordination of the interests of some lower creature to the interests of a higher creature. And that's the very structure of the world as God created and interprets it.
Can you say it again?
Yeah, the subordination of the interests of one creature to the higher interests of some other creature is the one is consecrated to the other. And then the next step in the process is to see how one form of consecration is that of sacrifice, where a lower order somehow itself has to undergo conversion, change, loss, or assimilation of some kind in order to serve the higher interests. And that comes to pretty good expression when we consider the relationship of days 2 and 5 and the realm of the air and the sea, or for that matter, the land on day 3, to the animals, where in order to support the life of the birds and the fish or the animals of day 6, the soil of the earth and the air and the water and the things that grow in there, these things are all undergo a process, as we just tried to describe, of loss, conversion, assimilation, and so on into these higher beings in order to serve. And so there's a kind of sacrifice that they undergo. And then narrowing things down further, a particular form of sacrificial consecration is that of death. When the lower order, in being subordinated to serve the higher interests of the higher orders, is something that is organic, that is alive, then it can undergo the loss of its life. It can undergo death in order to serve the higher beings. And as I say, that happens, assume then, as you were talking about, something like vegetation created on in day 3 frame, and the loss of life that it undergoes in becoming food for for animals as well as men. But even in the normal course of things, even apart from being eaten, the way in vegetation lives and dies, and fruit falls off a tree or whatever and dies, death is present in the realm of vegetation. And I hope people wouldn't be arguing with that thought, although apparently some do. I was talking about that volume on creation and the part of it that Ross was writing for in defense of the day age view, and he has some interesting things that he develops to the point here that this is indeed something that is legitimately called death when vegetation undergoes death, and it was of course inevitable in the whole course of things that would happen. In Kingdom Prologue here, I was dealing with that and pointed out how that kind of language is applied to the realm of vegetation by our Lord and by Paul, where they speak about the grain, the wheat, corn falling into the ground, and except it dies, it doesn't bring forth fruit. Now, so that's Jesus, that's Paul's own way of referring to this. They refer to this as death, in that sense. Granted, vegetation death is of a lower order than human death, sure, but it is death. And so there is that phenomenon of something that is alive losing its life, and this long before the fall takes place. Now things get stickier, of course, when you lift it up a notch and you start talking about animals. And here are human beings. And so, okay, there was vegetation death, but they don't want to talk about animal death. And the problem is they've been brainwashed by the SPCA and all the idiot modern conservationists who look at animal life in an anthropocentric way and interpret what happens to animals as if the animals were human beings, and they're not. And you can't interpret what happens to them in those terms. And so we have to get rid of this kind of remnant of ancient animism where everything is like this sacred in the same order in New Age nonsense. Got to get rid of this and think in biblical terms of animals for what they are, and they're not human beings, and their death is perfectly appropriate to serve the higher interests of man. that I would end up as saying is the biblical teaching. But now how to demonstrate that, what are the objections to that point of view, we're trying to deal with them. And I think we can focus the thing then in terms of that precise question of man in relation to animals, especially in terms of diet. And whether, apart from the fall, it would have been right and proper for man to take the life of animals. In other words, for there to be death in the animal realm in order to feed a human being. So that's where we're going to focus this question. What's the biblical evidence, pro or con, if there is any con? I'm going to be maintaining that right from the beginning that was perfectly appropriate and presumably happened or would have happened quite apart from the fall. Now, I think you can see that as we plunge into this, then that we are raising the questions about what is the meaning of blessing and curse. How was the world apart from the fall a realm of unmixed blessing if it involved things such as death in the world? And so we're trying to get a proper definition of that idea before we're through. Now let's see, where's a good place to begin here. Middle of page 35, I guess, under death, blessing, and curse. A question that calls for consideration in this connection is whether the idea of man before the fall sacrificing animal life for his own higher interests is compatible with the Bible's representations concerning the original state of blessedness. And so I point out a few general things first of all. First is the general principle that all creation is consecrated to, subordinated to man's higher interests. So that would lead to the thought that man can do what he wants with animal life. Secondly, the principle of sacrifice and death are already present in the world order at other levels. So the consecration of all to man, the presence of death of some kind at least is in the world beforehand. These things, I think, prepare us to accept that man could take animal life, sacrifice it to serve himself in various ways, for food, but also in a variety of other ways, to use its skin and so on for clothing, and all the manifold uses we put animal to, including, although it involves their death. Since all creatures were subordinated to man's dominion, and as we have seen, sacrifice and death enter the original order as particular expressions of the consecration principle, there would appear to be no obvious principial objection to man's having had the right to kill animals to provide himself with animal flesh for food, or animal skins for clothing, or for other purposes. Moreover, it is generally conceded, even by some who resist the idea of man's being authorized from the beginning to take animal life, it's usually conceded that the study of natural history shows that all manner of animals had lived and perished even before man appeared on the earth. So not just before the fall, but even before the creation of man, the evidence is overwhelming that there are all kinds of species, millions and millions of them, that existed and were exterminated and were replaced by others all along, and so there was death in the animal world by reason of, I say it's generally conceded, maybe some of you don't want to concede it. Again, I would suggest that you read some of Ross's stuff where he emphasizes this point of how many millions of varieties of species there have come and gone, each preparing for the next stage in development leading up to a world that was enriched with the kind of fossil remains and oil and energy and then all kinds of things necessary for man's life here. But maybe you don't want to concede that, and therefore I try to cite a couple of biblical verses that point in the same direction, that it was part of the original goodly order of things that God created, that animals were to serve as food for man. The first one is Psalm 104, verse 21, not necessarily food for man, but that there was death in the animal world. Psalm 104, verse 21, as I recall, that's the one where God is, the psalmist is extolling the wisdom of God's works of the creation of the world, the way he made all things to serve creatively, the way in which he made the day and the night to function within the total order of things. And in creating the night, the good creator had in mind those little lion cubs that were going to be hungry and would be roaring out to their parents that please bring us some wildebeest chops for breakfast or so on. And so God makes the night when the daddy lion can go stalking the prey more effectively and bring down that critter that is going to be breakfast cereal for his little whelping cub in the morning. And that's the way that the Psalm 104 delights in the wisdom of God, that he arranged the things in that way when the predator animals would be going forth to get their prey. The predators, yeah, sure, the predators. And what are predators except those that take the life of others? That's part of the natural ecological food chain thing, as the good Lord created it to be, according to Psalm 104, which is a beautiful, poetic sort of reflection, development of the whole story of creation and the wisdom of God. 1 Timothy 4, verses 3 through 5 is making the point that animals were things that God made for this very purpose, to be received and enjoyed with thanksgiving. And he says, now there are some who are wrong in forbidding you to eat this and that, and presumably, especially animal flesh. No, I mean, they're completely wrong-headed, says Paul. These creatures God made, he made them in the first place, that they should serve this purpose of eating man. So the biblical indicators are in support of the general principles that we would gather, that there was nothing wrong with this, that there was animal death from the beginning, and not just that the species were becoming extinct by reason of natural calamities or preying upon one another, but including the thought that they could become used up as man himself would avail himself of them. So that I see it as rather clear biblical evidence. And what then of the usual objections? Now on pages 35, 36, 37, I tried to deal with the objections I've heard to this. If you have another one that I haven't dealt with, I'll be glad to entertain a question or a comment later on. But right now, I'd just like to deal with the time we have left with some of the most commonly heard objections to this thesis that there was death in the world before, animal death in the world before the fall, including man's actually killing them. The counter-arguments are often drawn from statements concerning man's diet in Genesis 1:29 and 9:3 should be considered. In Genesis, the end of the creation story, it sort of develops the hierarchy of things, where you have the realm of vegetation and animals and man. And it brings this out, for one thing, by dealing with what you could eat and who could eat which. Well, that vegetation is lower down on the scale of this hierarchy is indicated by the fact that animals can eat vegetation, and of course men can eat the vegetation, so vegetation is down here. And then it goes on to describe the superiority of man over the animal world. And at this point, it is not stated in those specific terms of eating, but in more general terms of ruling over, and for obvious reasons. Now, the opposition is that you don't get an explicit statement that man can eat animals. You don't get an explicit statement that man can eat animals, and so that silence is read into as being tantamount to a prohibition. But that's reading into it something that isn't there, and one can understand why the superiority of the headship of man over animals would not be stated in that limited, precise way of man's being able to eat. Yes, of course he could eat, but there are so many other things that he does whereby his rule over animals comes to expression. As we've said, he kills them in order to use their hides as clothing or as material for a tent that He uses animals to pull his plow. He uses animals to provide transportation for himself. Multiple ways in which man's lordship over the animals is expressed, and so no need then to reduce it just to the fact that he could eat it. Therefore, you can't read into the silence at that point more than is there. And then, secondly, why it says that man can eat vegetation is clear enough, because this is setting the stage for the third chapter and the whole test of man's obedience, which needs this particular background. When God says that you shall not eat of this particular tree, the force of that as a test of obedience involves precisely the fact that it was a contradiction of the general fact that God had given all vegetation to man to eat, and now out of that general area he takes this one tree as an exception. So there are various reasons that would explain why it says that man may eat vegetation, but also various reasons that explain why it doesn't say that specifically that man could eat animal flesh. And so it's a question of such exegesis. It's almost done. Let me see if I can say something about Genesis 9 verse, whatever the verse is in Genesis 9. 3 here. And now after that, then you get this statement that we just read in Genesis 9:3. Now, just to give the conclusions, and obviously we'll have to come back and do something further. Please be reading it. The way it works out, as I understand it, is this: right from the beginning, the man could eat anything he wanted, but especially now, from the fall on, that was the case. But within the ark, we, for the first time, encounter a distinction between clean and unclean. Clean and unclean animals that could be brought into the ark, and there are more clean animals brought in than unclean. And the reason then that we end up with is, in part, that they were going to be eating of the clean animals, and therefore you needed some extra ones so that there would still be at least a pair that emerge on the far end. Now that's the way things work within a theocracy. Within Israel, once again, you get the distinction between clean and unclean animals. And within a theocracy, you encounter that distinction, which brings out the difference between you as God's people and the rest of the world out there. This is just a way of reinforcing one's sensitivity to that. Within a theocracy, you can't eat all kinds of meat. You can only eat clean meat. In a common grace situation, you can eat any kind. You don't have clean, unclean distinctions there. Now the point is, they're no longer in a theocracy. They come out of the ark. That's done. And so now, back to the ordinary common grace arrangements. Now, once again, just as you could always eat all kinds of vegetation, so again you can eat all kinds of anything that moves. And it isn't saying now for the first time I give you this permission. And what is especially interesting is that, look, history repeats itself. You get again in Israel a situation of clean and unclean, and within that you don't eat unclean meats. But Genesis 9 and 10, and Genesis 9 repeats itself in Acts 10. When that situation is coming to an end, and here is Peter, and he can't get over the thought that that's the rule of the day, that you don't eat unclean animals, and God wants to tell him, you're no longer in a theocracy. You're back in common grace again, the way he told Noah after the ark experience, now after the Israel experience. You're back in common grace again. So the sheet is let down from heaven with all kinds of meat. Kill Peter, taken and eaten. And so he's finally convinced now that it's okay back in the common grace to eat all kinds. Now that's the point then in Genesis 9. That now once again they can eat all kinds of meats. And so that as a matter of fact, Genesis 9:3 is saying the exact opposite. It's not saying now for the first time you can do this. Genesis 9:3 is actually proof that previously that had been the normal thing. Once again, now you can eat not just clean meat, but all kinds of meats. And so that passage is also, and then there's the whole other question of prophetic language concerning heaven as a place where the animals lie down in peace and are no longer predatory, and there's all kinds of considerations there as to what kind of language this is, and it's not literal and so forth. So next time, and so be prepared that next week, for Thursday, material will be subject to the exam, and when the exam is